All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, from wherever you are. We are so excited today to have a special guest with us, Chad Sanderson from Gable AI, to really dig into what it means to shift left in your tech stack, right? I think this is an up and coming term, and there are different variations of what it means and what it's used for, and when it can be really helpful when thinking about how to apply this within your tech stack. So today we're going to go through 5 different myths about shifting left and debunk them, right? Let's talk about what they are and why that's not necessarily relevant or true when you're thinking about shifting left in your tech stack. So we'll get started here really quick, just level setting a little bit. Like, what the heck, Chad, does shifting left mean to you, right? What does it actually mean when we say shifting left?
So for me, shifting left is all about the transference of data management, ownership, and accountability to the teams that are generating the data and the teams who use the data. I would say that today, almost 100% of that responsibility falls on the consumption team. So if you're a data engineer or a data scientist or data analyst, it is your responsibility to integrate the data, to clean the data, to understand what the data means, to build the pipeline, to ensure quality, and to ensure governance. And this is kind of the way that things are at most organizations. However, that's leaving out half the responsibility of data management, which is that data actually starts off from a producer. This is the left. So if you're a software engineer or a salesperson or your operations team working in Microsoft Excel, you are a data generator. And if you're not enforcing quality and governance and other data management best practices at the source, then there's really no way to prevent data quality issues and errors and change management problems downstream.
Exactly. I think that key phrase there when we're thinking about it is at the source. I think that's exactly right. And we define it, I guess, the same way really here at MetaRouter, where you're taking things like you said, like data governance, quality, accuracy, and instead of addressing that downstream in your different maybe platforms, right? Your ad tech, your analytics, your CDPs, whatever that might be, and really shifting that left again to the source at the point of collection. And that's what we mean when we say shifting left in your tech stack, right? Doing these things maybe earlier than traditionally is the case right now. So that's what we're thinking about when we're talking about shifting left today. And one of the big key reasons that we want to think about doing this in our tech stack, kind of level setting again, is really catching and addressing issues sooner in the process. So again, whether that's data quality, that's compliance issues, so pushing data governance to the left, reducing your costs in doing so as well, right? You potentially reduce redundancies and you clean up the data ahead of time so you're not having to do that maybe in a more expensive way downstream. So lots of benefits to shifting left. And I think maybe it's easier than a lot of us joining think as well, right? So let's get into what those myths are and what we can talk about debunking today. One of the key things I do want to call out, and Chad would love to hear your thoughts as well, is like this idea of shifting left. We do talk about data governance. I think I've seen more and more in the news about things like data breaches or data leaks, like issues that are coming up from a compliance standpoint for companies that haven't necessarily considered shifting left in their tech stack. And I'm curious to hear if you've kind of been hearing the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that shift left has been happening for at least 2 decades in other areas of software engineering. So DevOps, I think, is a great example of shift left in action. You used to have a centralized, release management team, and that team would oversee, shipping every new version of an application that was being pushed to customers. And these days, it's the federated teams that are doing this. The teams that are actually responsible for writing the code are also the ones that are responsible for deploying their code. And now I'd say over the past like 5 to 7 years, we've seen very similar things with security engineering. Previously, you had your centralized security teams, and they would have tools for analyzing code vulnerabilities, but their responsibility was all about like, how do we go and enforce these standards to every other engineering organization within the company.
Yeah.
And as a cost center, that's very challenging to do. And now we're seeing products that are way more focused on how do you actually check for those code vulnerabilities at the time that pull requests are being merged. And so you're getting that shift left with a minimal amount of effort on the side of the actual application developers or the producers. And I think it's now data's turn, where the same patterns that DevOps and security has gone through, I think data is going through. And data is a bit unique in that the data producers are not just engineers. They might be, like I said, operations people. It could be someone making changes within a Salesforce instance. It could be your SAP developers. There's lots of different types of data producers. So yeah, I think we've been seeing these patterns happen for a long time, and data is a little bit late to the party.
I think you're right. And in this situation, maybe better late than never. But how do we, capitalize on this shift, I guess, pun intended, right, to where we are focused more on the data specific side of the story, right? So I think that's a really good call out, and something that I'm excited to really dig into what that means, because there is a huge opportunity to all the things you just mentioned, the benefits of shifting left within that, right? So these are the 5 myths we will be debunking today, and we'll go through them one by one. But if you have thoughts, comments, ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll make this really engaging and exciting as best we can. So let's dive into it. Our first myth is that shifting left slows down the data pipeline. Chad, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of the most common concerns when I talk to companies that are thinking about shifting left or shifting ownership of data back to data producers. There is a fear that those producer teams are going to respond very negatively and to say things like, well, I don't really care about the data. Why would I slow myself down just so I can make the lives better of analysts or product managers or data scientists or whoever it is that uses the data? And it's a bit of Stockholm syndrome, I find, because teams have been asking these questions for a long time. They have been going to their data producers and telling them when things fail, and they haven't necessarily gotten good responses. So this is learned feedback. It's not something that came out of nowhere. But I do think that the reason why it's a myth is because the tooling itself, at least that has existed for the past few years, is not actually designed for the producer. It's designed for consumers. And what teams have done is to say, hey, we want you producers to take ownership over our consumer tools to manage data on our behalf. So in the case of the modern data stack, that might look like saying, we produce a lot of tables. Within Snowflake, we use dbt to create our data model and Airflow to build out our orchestration system. Software engineering teams, we want you to now take ownership over Snowflake tables and dbt models and Airflow jobs, and you are going to make sure that this data lands successfully in your raw layer.
Yeah.
And they don't want to do that. But if you design the tooling that's more for the workflows that these upstream producers already have, it becomes so much easier to take ownership of, and the argument from a engineering manager perspective more or less goes away.
Yeah, I think, that kind of overwhelming, the requests keep flowing in, right? And it's like, the ownership piece, I think, is critical here, right? And I think once you kind of build for that and you clarify what those roles and responsibilities look like, right? What is that ownership and why is that important? Really helps within the whole conversation. So it's the tooling and the people, it's the tech and the people. And I think once you get that right and you have a strategy, like shifting left does not in any way slow down the pipeline. In fact, it actually really speeds it up. So like an example we've talked about before, I think, Chad, is like how the idea of early identification, resolution of data issues leads to faster insights in the long run, right? Like cleaning that up. So when you build the tech, you have the tech in place in a way that is shifted left and you have that clear ownership and communication, I think it actually really speeds up the process, really makes your whatever you do with that data faster, right? And so I think safe to say, myth number 1, debunked, right? I think that's a good way to think about it. So when you're thinking about shifting left, 2 things to keep in mind. It does not slow down your data pipeline, actually speeds it up, and what you're doing with that data as well. And And really what you're working with on teams can be sped up when you have the right tech and communication in place. All right, we got myth number 2. Data quality is solely the responsibility of the data engineering team. Chad, I know you already touched on this a little bit. Would love to dig maybe a little bit deeper in terms of like what that kind of collaboration looks like and how to, I don't know, I feel like overcome that fear of going to different teams with these ideas of shifting left when it comes to data quality.
Yeah, well, I think that data engineers today are in a pretty tough spot because generally they are centralized or your data platform team is centralized. And there are good reasons for that. Building data pipelines and enforcing data quality and data governance is somewhat of a specialty skill. And when you hire a team of 5 to 10 or 20 data engineers in a company, it's very easy to offload all of that work to them. The conversations I always used to have when I led the data engineering and data platform team at Convoy was about the inability of my organization to take ownership over the data itself. And that's because our team was the infrastructure layer in the middle, but we weren't creating the business logic that sat on top of the data downstream. We weren't building dashboards or machine learning models or whatever it was. And yet, when these models or dashboards or pipelines failed, those teams would come to us and say, "Hey, data platform, can you guys resolve this issue?" Um, this led to a pretty massive backlog of work. We ended up spending most of our time doing ad hoc tasks for other people in the company instead of thinking strategically about the way that data really needed to be treated inside of the organization. What is our data security posture? How are we making investments into AI? What should our data quality, what should our data architecture look like? What should our policy be about around resolving data quality issues? So the centralized team is in a pretty tough spot, I think. And part of that, the reason it's so tough is because the full responsibility of data quality and data governance falls on their shoulders. So not only is that really bad just from like a team management and cohesiveness perspective, but it's actually not even physically possible, right? So if you're an upstream software engineer, as an example, and let's say you make a change to your code and you impact an event, and that event flows through to a transactional database, and then from there we pick up these new records and push them into Snowflake and then or Databricks, and then once they're in these locations, we start piping them into dashboards and things like that. The issue is I, as an engineer, might make a very reasonable change for my application. Maybe I'm rolling out a new feature. That new feature does require new data to be collected, and I might want to get rid of the previous event. But if I don't communicate and I don't tell anyone that this event is going away, then everyone downstream of me is going to be impacted by a pretty nasty data quality issue. And oftentimes, even if I do communicate, it's not always clear how that data is transformed in between the code that I've produced and the eventual table that's leveraging that data. So it could go through many different transformation steps along the way. And that also can cause data quality issues. So the data engineering team really can't scale if they have ownership over all of the quality in the company. And then B, a lot of the quality issues are caused by data producers who have no idea who they're impacting when they make changes.
Yeah.
So I think in order for this federated sort of shift left model to work, then all of the teams that ultimately are touching data at some point in the pipeline have to take ownership of quality in that particular stage.
100%. I think that kind of call out specifically about it's just not realistic, right? For this necessarily to be the case. And I think there's this ownership that we talked about before, but also the willingness to do the work, but that conversation that has to happen to really make the magic happen, right? To really effectively shift left. And specifically, if we're talking about data quality, though data governance is part of this as well, is that kind of proactive approach and having those conversations by shifting left. And I think what we kind of hear a lot is like, no one necessarily wants to bring these ideas forward. So they kind of, there's this maybe false assumption that it's going to fall on the data engineering team's shoulders, which again, shouldn't be the conversation. Everyone should feel confident enough to at least open the conversation, not be afraid of getting shut down or, what the implications might be, but really to talk through it so that, it takes a village, right, to get this stuff right. And so I think with that, 100% debunked, it takes everyone that's dealing with that data come together, have a conversation, then clearly outlining those responsibilities like we mentioned. So I think that's a really good call out. And those producers and consumers, like that kind of balance that has to happen is important to think through as well. All right, myth number 3, shifting left requires a complete overhaul of existing workflows. I know this is something we hear a lot, again, kind of thinking back to the complexity that is associated typically with the idea of shifting left. But Chad, what do you think? Complete overhaul or total myth?
I think it has to be a complement in order for it to really work at any sort of scale. I think when I talk to companies, especially the larger businesses that are making very heavy investments into their data, you see highly heterogeneous data sources. So one data source might be Salesforce, another might be Google Analytics, a third could be a Python dictionary that's used to generate events. You may have Amplitude or Segment or something like that that teams are using as well. You may have some Excel spreadsheets that are being populated by the finance team, and that ultimately is fed into the data. And to ask all of those data producers to use a brand new workflow is just completely unreasonable. These teams have a pretty they have a historical precedent to how they work. They're not going to change it just to make the data nicer. And I actually used to work in a discipline called conversion rate optimization. And we would look at websites and we would analyze how people kind of move through websites and ultimately how we could increase the rate at which people bought products. And one of the largest components of that was friction reduction. And friction reduction means the more difficult it is to get to the end state. So the harder it is to actually find the product you want to buy, the more drop off you will see at every stage in the funnel. And the same really applies here. The more difficult it is and the more work a data producer has to do to take ownership of the data for the benefit of the downstream data teams, the less likely it is that it will actually happen. So I think in order for shift left to work, you have to meet these data producers where they are in the tools and systems that they already use, and you cannot meaningfully or substantially change their workflow beyond what they're already doing day to day. And we've seen a precedent for this in the security space. So a company that I really love, they're called Sneak. They integrate into the DevOps workflow for an engineering team, and they scan open source software packages for vulnerabilities. And Sneak basically maintains this library of what is the state of all the different versions of many open source products, and then it can provide that real-time feedback in the pull request itself without asking the engineers to ever go into another tool. So the security engineering is brought to you, not the other way around. And they've been very successful at that. And I think that data should follow a similar approach.
I love that kind of idea of a proactive approach too. It's like, how do you, the whole point of shifting left is to address this stuff up front. So the tooling that you can use kind of, I guess I would say natively almost, right, to check that stuff up front. I think there's also this idea of kind of like centralization as well. Like, is there a way to have a centralized, collection point or bringing things into a key source where you can do all that cleaning and normalization things up front that, again, complement existing workflows. And then for wherever that data is going downstream, you're kind of ready to go. So I think that's a really good point. It's like how to be proactive, how to do things up front, things that complement, that fit into an existing workflow is really key to shifting left. And I think something like Sneak, for example, makes it easier than, again, I think people realize. So I would say very much debunked. It's not a complete overhaul. It's plugging into what already exists and finding more streamlined ways to do things that the team's already doing and being smarter and more proactive about it. I think spot on 100%. So the next idea here, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, but really shifting left is only relevant for complex data pipelines is the myth, right? I think something that we hear a lot in MetaRouter is that if I have, less than say 50 data pipelines, for example, that shifting left doesn't apply or there isn't benefit in shifting left, right? Things like that, or, it only really provides value if the pipeline's really complex. So Chad, would love to hear your thoughts on really what you think about the benefit of shifting left is and like where that applies in terms of like complexity of an organization.
So I think where companies really benefit from shifting left is where that upstream ownership translates into meaningful ROI for the downstream data product owners. So as an example of that, at Convoy, we had a machine learning model that was super important to the business. It was our pricing model. And that data came from 6 or 7 or 8 different sources. But I wouldn't say that the pipelines in and of themselves were all that complicated. There were just a meaningful number of them. And each of the people who own these pipelines or who own the sources through which this pipeline was derived were different. So they sat on different teams, they had different goals, they had different processes for modifying and updating their data. And if any one of those teams made a change that was negative for the machine learning model, there was a very clear cost impact that we could assign back to the row level, right? Like a null field would have to get thrown out, and that would make our training data that much less accurate. And so even though the pipeline itself wasn't supremely complicated, because a single data quality issue did have a meaningful amount of impact, it was very clear, it was very easy for us to justify the cost of ownership upstream. There's other folks that we work with where their data is coming from a third-party provider. So someone like Atlassian, and they're pulling in a lot of Atlassian data. And that data might change at any time. Atlassian might decide to change the schema. They may decide to change the business structure. And if there's nothing in place that is trying to detect those issues as early as humanly possible, then the impact could be really severe by the time that you do detect it, which is after the data pipelines have already run. And the same goes for tools like Google Sheets and Excel spreadsheets and stuff like that. There's a lot of businesses that run their accounting FP&A, their entire FP&A process off of Google and Excel. And these pipelines are relatively simple, but they're so critical to get right to the business. And even a single error can have really meaningful costs associated with that. So I think it's less about the complexity of the pipeline, and it's more about the importance and the utility of the data. And if the data is very important to the business, I think that the shift left is warranted.
I think that's a really good way of thinking of it too. It's not necessarily the complexity of the pipeline or, even necessarily how many there are, but there really is that kind of ingrained benefit of catching these things ahead of time. I mean, yes, from like data quality, especially when you're feeding tools like AI, I think that's like a very hot topic of conversation, but it makes sense. Like in order for AI to work, one, it needs a lot of data, right? It's kind of step one, but it has to be good data. Otherwise, your models are really messed up. I've seen like predictive audience kind of AI, things like that going totally rogue and wrong because the data isn't accurate. It's not tied to the right people. It's, taking certain activities and counting it as something incorrect. Like there's a lot that goes into something like AI. But again, this shifting left mentality of doing that up front, identifying the issues before you're in triage, right? I think we in the data governance world too see things like, identifying an issue, maybe a PII was leaked, a data breach, whatever it might be. But by the time you're flagging an issue in a system, like you're already in triage, it's already a problem. So you need to take care of that sooner by shifting left up front. And I think really for all data projects, regardless of like size and quality, there is a huge benefit when shifting left. So safe to say, I think this one is also debunked. All right, Chad, it's our last one here. So the idea of shifting left can be applied in downstream tooling is the myth. So let's think about how we talked about the importance of doing things at the source versus downstream. What does that kind of give and take look like? And what are the differences in doing something downstream versus doing something at the source?
Yeah, well, all of this is not to say that having downstream tooling is bad. In fact, I think the opposite. I think it's really important to have great downstream tools for reliability and quality. And if we look at the software space, this is definitely also true, right? Companies like Datadog focus more on reactive measures when they detect JavaScript errors or latency issues or other SLAs not meeting compliance. But there's also a huge amount of tooling that software engineers use on the preventative and the proactive side as well. For instance, GitHub falls into this category, right? Before code is ever merged into a main branch, you go through a relatively lengthy process where unit tests have to pass, integration tests have to pass. There's usually a manual code review, so you're sharing the actual changes between software engineers. There's a point in time for feedback, and then there's a whole process that runs after that to ensure that when the merge has happened, that was safe and healthy and nothing broke. And you can imagine what the world would look like if GitHub didn't exist, right? If none of those upstream processes were around and all we had was the reactive processes, it means engineers would basically be on call 24/7 responding to issues all the time. And in fact, the simple existence of Datadog in that world may actually even make the engineer's life worse because they would be overwhelmed with the number of alerts that they were getting. It wouldn't be able to spend that much time working on the product. And then imagine if, while all of these really horrific things are going on, there was only one team at the company that was dealing with all of these problems simultaneously. That is the state of data today. And I think that's what those are sort of the old shackles that we need to break free from. And we need to start treating the entire industry and learn from software engineering all the mistakes and learnings that software engineers have made over the last 20 years and not fall into those same traps. So can you apply these measures downstream in a reactive fashion? Of course you can. But is it preferable? No. Does it allow your business to scale? No, it does not. Does it support? Does it make sense for a centralized team to manage? No, it does not. And do you have the ability to actually resolve problems when they do occur in a timely and healthy way? No, you do not. And so pure reactive ownership of data quality and data governance and compliance issues, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, really puts all the accountability on the downstream teams to manage data and changes that they're not actually accountable for and don't understand. So is it necessary? Absolutely. Is it sufficient? No.
I mean, nothing even to add. That was so well said. I think there has forever, you're right, it's a combination of the proactive and reactive, but without the proactive approach, I mean, that idea of, yes, having someone on call 24/7 is like very scary and very real. Like there wouldn't be another way to do it, right? So I think easy to say, yes, that one definitely debunked in the fact that like you need a little bit of both and downstream tooling is important, but without that kind of upfront piece part, it really causes for chaos. So like you said, can't scale, can't do all these other things. And so I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle when thinking about the benefit of shifting left. So very well said. I could not have said it better myself. And so this idea too, and of course, I want to talk quickly about how we do this at MetaRouter is 100% we do things at the source. So as a, customer data platform, right? Really this infrastructure focused on making sure that the customer data, the behavioral data you're collecting is clean, compliant, secure upfront before it's powering any, customer data type tooling, CDPs, analytics platforms, your customer, marketing engagement platform, whatever it might be. We want to make sure that it's clean at the source. So again, wherever that data flows, wherever that data is going from a consumer perspective, it's really ready to go. And you're not, up at night thinking about, oh my gosh, is my customer data going to be breached? Is there going to be a problem? And like, do I need to worry about triaging, instances that come up where, something was leaked in Facebook or wherever it might be. I'm sorry, Meta. That's still working in my brain. But I think that idea of cleaning things up the source, realizing that there is benefit for any type of data pipeline, for any, type of team, there is a really strong reason that the industry is shifting left that it needs to, and a really maybe easier approach in applying this than people may think. So I think that's a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about shifting left. So we kind of talked through all of this. I'll just make sure everyone has this to really think about what those key pillars of shifting left are and how it can benefit your organization. So whether you are a data producer, a data consumer, I highly encourage you all to kind of think through, like, how does this apply to me? Where can I maybe implement this in terms of the tools we already have? And where can I see the benefit, right? And like, we want to encourage you to have those conversations. Don't be afraid to have a conversation about shifting left, why you think that's important, what it can bring in terms of value, security, quality to your systems, and really think about what that means for your organization as a whole. And I have to say, Chad, I did do a pre-read of your kind of early release of the data contracts book that you are working on. So I'd love for you to share just a little bit about what you're working on and maybe why people should check it out.
Yeah, well, thank you for the plug. We are working on a book around data contracts. So the book will cover how you can start basically creating APIs for your data, data SLAs, expectations, and policies, and then how to enforce those SLAs and expectations programmatically in code, sometimes as part of a DevOps process, or even through other third-party tools like Salesforce or SAP or Google Analytics or Microsoft Excel. So with the first 2 chapters of the book are available now on our website, gable.ai. You can download it for free. And then in a few days, the next 2 chapters will be coming for early release as well. So definitely check that out. And if you sign up to our newsletter and product waitlist, then you'll just get those in the mail.
And I have to say, I did read the first couple chapters, so that's perfect timing. I need something for the weekend, but it's absolutely worth a read. I have to say, Chad, the way that you have made kind of maybe more technical content really approachable, but really like from your real world experiences has been super powerful for me to learn about data contracts, but also just a good way to think about it kind of holistically as you're thinking about this, kind of shift in the industry as well. So yeah, definitely worth a read. It's really, really well written. And with that, I think we will open it to some questions if the team has any. All right, Chad, looks like we've got maybe 2 here. A little bit long. Let's see. How can implementing data contracts early in the development process enhance consistency and reliability in a customer data stack?
Yeah, so I can definitely talk about data contracts. We didn't touch on them too much during this presentation, but the high level is that data contracts are akin to APIs for data. So they're interfaces, and they represent a interaction object. The problem today is that data is very heterogeneous. You have many different types of data sources coming from many different places, and that heterogeneity does not allow data teams to standardize their approach to data quality or data management or data governance. And there's also no central mechanism of ownership for the producer teams. The data contract seeks to address both of those issues. In terms of the technical form that the contract takes, there's a few different ways of doing it. The way that we do it is a YAML file, pretty generic, and that YAML file contains information about the schema of the data object, the SLA of the data itself. So how many records do you expect over a 1-hour period, for example? Maybe you wouldn't expect a customer to you wouldn't expect to see customer data at midnight if your stores close at 6 p.m. This type of thing. Then there's the business logic of the data. So how is that schema composed? The semantics is another way to think of it. If I've got a column that's called distance in miles, if the underlying logic that composes that column suddenly changes to be distance in kilometers, but nothing actually changes, a contract would be able to detect something like that in a way that a simple sort of schema check would not. And then you have all of your other metadata-based policies, like whether the data contains PII, if there are certain access patterns that need to be applied to the data, certain data security measures that need to be taken. Once these data contracts exist, they can be codified, version controlled, and then treated as the source of truth of every data source. And then you can layer on top of these contracts mechanisms of enforcement. And the enforcement mechanisms might exist at different places in the data pipeline. So if you wanted to prevent schema changes, for example, that's something that you could enforce in the code base itself. If you wanted to check on an SLA, then you would have to examine the data as it flows from that source system to the destination system. There are some places where you might want to unpack the contents of the file. And so those are really the three layers. Is you have the object, the actual data source, you have the contract which contains the constraints, and then you have the mechanism of enforcing that contract, which can be pointed at a specific technology. And if you do that at all of the places where your data sources exist, and you can do it pretty generically and pretty easily, it's a way to get coverage of data quality and data governance, to treat all your data in the same way, and to have an object that your data producers can take ownership of.
I think that's very well said, because I think this idea of, actually we have another question for it. I'll pull it up here. But this idea of like, what is a data contract and how specifically does it apply? It's a good segue for, we've got this question, data contract versus a data clean room. So yeah. I think, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that I've sort of laid out the data contract pretty clearly. I think that the data clean room is a slightly different it's a slightly different concept. So the clean room is more about sort of data sharing in a way that doesn't compromise either side. The data contract is all about, are the constraints, are our expectations of the data actually being met? Yeah. So one is more of a mechanism for sharing, and then the other one is sort of the rules about what the data should be. You could certainly combine both of these two ideas together. So you could have a data clean room, and you could have data contracts that sit on top of the data in that clean room, and that would obscure certain security and potentially private information about the data. Or you could have one without the other. I think that we are going to be moving to a world where contracts not only exist internally between teams, but also across companies as well. My belief is that it will follow a very similar pattern as APIs, where microservices and APIs like really sort of started off internal to companies as a way for teams to more easily access their own applications. But then they became sort of the de facto standard of communicating across companies. I think contracts will more or less take the same approach, and I think the clean room is certainly a concept that can be applied within the context of the data contract as well.
I think that layering is a really good way to think about it. And, you heard it here first about, here's the prediction to keep in mind for the future. Because I do agree. I think we are going to transition eventually to that point, because of the power of what a data contract is and how it can, like you said, that third layer of enforcing it is really important throughout as well. So I think that's a good way to think about it. All right. Looks like we have one more question for today. Which is an interesting one, because of course I'm going to say it depends, but what is the best way, or I guess best use case to start with when shifting left? Where can I see value faster to get buy-in about shifting left?
Yeah. So the way that I like to think about this is starting with a tangible problem. The idea of shifting left, even though it does sound like a pretty generic horizontal approach, to me is best undertaken as a vertical approach. You do not actually need to shift left ownership everywhere that data exists within your company. It should happen where there is a need for that ownership, and that ownership adds some value to the downstream teams that are leveraging the data. I mentioned an example before of a machine learning model. So within the context of that machine learning model, we worked out what the data lineage was, where the data that fed into the features of the model were coming from, the teams that owned that data, and then shifted left specifically within that sort of body and scope of work. And when data contracts and other mechanisms existed, then what you can do is say, well, based on previous outages or incidents or problems that we had, if these contracts or whatever other form of shifting left exists had been there from the beginning, we would have prevented incident number, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and
Yeah.
that would have had this amount of material impact on the business. And now we have this level of visibility into how data is being changed and updated at the company, and that justifies the broader rollout across the organization. The other thing that I will say is when you are trying to sell this to a leadership team, for example, especially a technical leadership team, the things you need to understand is that they don't really care about data engineering best practices. They sort of have a few key concerns, which is who, number one, who do they waggle the finger at if something goes wrong? Is it
Yes.
very clear who should have accountability and what those next steps actually are? And number two, what is the risk profile? Meaning, are they in a really bad spot today? Are they in a really good spot today? What does bad even mean within the context of the business, and what would it take to get to good? These are the sort of high level ways of thinking that data and sort of technical leaders really need to know. And so, if you can provide that information to them as part of starting to shift left, it would add a tremendous amount of context. And so when I say something like accountability, well, I mean, that's sort of the whole value of a data contract is you can point and say, if something goes wrong, here's exactly who you should go and speak to. And on the risk profile, it's really good to say, we have this many, at Convoy, we call these tier 0 data services. So there were applications of data that were generating money for the company or were used by someone else in some highly very high leverage sort of strategic use case. Like it was a dashboard our CFO looked at every single Monday to figure out our financial projections for the next month or something like that, right? You can identify all of these use cases and then say, okay, there are 50 data sources that power these 10 or 20 really high value use cases that we have at the company. These high value use cases are worth 20 or 30 million dollars altogether, and the cost of a single incident in one of these data sources is going to hit 3 or 4 or 5 of our tier 0 data services, and that will have in dollars of financial impact. And if you're able to frame the conversation in that way to a technical leader, it gets very scary very quickly, not having any visibility into these upstream systems at all. And the more that you can start to fill in the gaps as time goes on, the more excited that they will be to roll this out broadly across the company. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, it's like you've done this before now. But
Just a
that's
few times.
just a couple times. No, but I mean, so true. I think just even taking that last snippet and like clearly thinking through how to talk to stakeholders, what they care about, and even though is the way you talked about filling the gaps, I think is really, really powerful because it's not just like the value that you're going to see, but it's the prevention of regulatory fines, whatever it might be, like being able to quantify that to get people excited about and like speaking to what they truly care about, not just like, hey, let's shift left and here's why. Like, how do you quantify that? Is really powerful as well. So I think that's great. Okay, so it looks like with that, we are at the end of our session. So I want to say thank you all so much for joining today. This is really interesting, exciting. Chad, I feel like we could chat forever about this stuff. So thank you so much for joining as well. Definitely check out the data contracts book. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn directly. Check out our websites. It's metarouter.io or the Gable AI website as well. And we are happy to help with whatever we can, helping arm you with the tools you need to have these conversations to shift left effectively and really make a difference in your organization. So let us know how we can help. And thanks again for joining.